Welcome, everybody. I'm very pleased to see you all here. We're very, very lucky to have Michael Kremer giving the Kapuscinski Development Lecture. I will tell you in a little while how Michael is probably the best person to be giving this lecture, so I'm very happy that we could have him here tonight. But before doing so, I'll leave the floor to Mr. Emilio from the European Commission and Ian from the UNDP, who are the organizers and sponsors of this lecture series. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure, actually, for me to be here at the London School of Economics. And I would start my very short introduction by thanking Professor Bandiera, STICERD, I finally learned how you pronounce it, and of course the Department of Economics in LSE and the United Nations Development Programme, my colleague and friend Ian, who will address you in a minute. Let me just spend a few words to tell you what these lectures are all about. Basically, they've been around since 2009, and since then, the European Commission has been associated with the United Nations Development Programme to finance and promote these lectures together with some of the most prestigious universities in the world. The idea is that we want to discuss the many facets of international cooperation and development. And so far, as I said, we've held already more than 100 such lectures. And we estimate to have involved about 150,000 people who've followed these lectures one way or another. Now, the development lectures, they honor the name and the legacy of a very talented, I would say, and well-known Polish writer and journalist, Ryszard Kapuscinski. Thanks to his famous reportage and his books, which describe developing countries in all continents, he became known as the Third World Chronicler. To some, he was known as the voice of the poor. Now, I'm not here to discuss his style of writing or anything, but what matters is that he belongs to the very, I would say, small category of reporters who, through their work, have gained the unanimous recognition from their peers and from the public opinion. Kapuscinski is often quoted as saying, and I quote, that life is truly known only to those who suffer, lose, endure adversity, and stumble from defeat to defeat. And that's why today the words solidarity and partnership are particularly relevant. And we think, and this is Brussels thought, we think that these two concepts define what we mean by development. These two concepts, solidarity and partnership, they must go hand in hand. And this is not just for moral reasons, but also because they are a strategic imperative. We live in an interconnected world where the challenges are crucial and are global. No need to name them, but just think about energy, think about climate change, security, terrorism, migrations, gender equality, and worse, gender violence. Now, the world is changing, and we need to understand what's happening. We need to keep abreast of change if and we want to steer the future. Every Kapuscinski lecture brings something new, something fresh, I would say, to the table, and this one is no exception, and it is indeed a privilege to welcome for this lecture Professor Michael Kremer, who will discuss the impact that recent changes in technology have on development, and in particular on agriculture. Now, the European Union, since 2017, I would say, for the last couple of years, is committed to implement its own program, which is called Digital for Development. Basically, it's a strategy where we recognize that digital solutions can be enablers of development. development. And this is particularly true in the sector of sustainable agriculture and food security. Just think about real-time market data. Think about real-time weather conditions, weather data. Think about the use of drone and potentially one day, not too far, the use of blockchain technology in this sector. Now, these are all tools, very powerful tools, which could, if used properly, help smallholder farmers to access knowledge, to make informed choices and decisions, to improve their working methods, and, last but not least, to improve productivity, possibly, and hopefully their own livelihoods. So ICT can help solve some of the challenges that smallholders face every day. The precondition, the only precondition, is that these technological solutions need to be analyzed and they need to be implemented in the right context, which means considering a country's regulatory framework, considering market conditions, considering the level of food insecurity, and so on and so forth. So this is, in a nutshell, the kind of approach that the European Union has decided to adopt to privilege in supporting smallholder farmers in developing countries. So, Kapuscinski lectures, here we are. They exist because they want to provide students, NGOs, the media, policymakers, whoever is interested really in this area, to provide them with an opportunity to discuss topical development-related issues. So they basically, that's exactly what our distinguished speaker today, Professor Michael Kremer, does so very well. So I can just remind you that this event is live streamed, and I would also like to encourage the wider public, the wider audience, to join the debate via Twitter. The hashtag is KAPTalks, as in KAPTALKS. And with this, I thank you very much, and I really hope that you will enjoy tonight's lecture. Thank you. Jan Szyzinski from the United Nations Development Programme.
Thank you very much, Emilio, and thank you. I'd like to thank the European Commission for the strategic partnership with us on the lectures. And it's great to be, I think, for the second time already at LSE, so we feel a bit like home with the lectures. The more that actually we have, for the first time, we have the situation in which the former speaker, Professor Bandiera, of the Kapuscinski Lectures, is now hosting one of them. So the more we feel like being at home. And the more that we are here with daughter of Ryszard Kapuscinski, Ms. Rene Meissner. So it's a great privilege to and simply a joy to be here. The more that today's topic is, or maybe let's put it the other way. Usually we're speaking about big things, big policies, and ideas, which is always very important and needed. But sometimes we need to get to the ground, to particular needs of people, aspirations, limitations, and so on and so on. The same as Ryszard Kapuscinski actually focused on people. On individual persons in his writing, and I think the more today's topic is actually reflecting it, that from the big policies we're going a bit down to the ground to sometimes much more practical level. For instance, how the mobile applications could raise crops. So thank you very much for accepting the invitation, and I hope you'll enjoy the lecture. Thanks.
Okay, so I could probably spend till 8 p.m. giving you a list of all the achievements of Michael. I think you much rather listen to him. So the only thing I'm going to say is that probably many of you are too young to know that development economics was not as popular 20 years ago as it is now. I see here many of my students of the undergraduate course. There are over 150 of you in the undergraduate course. I see many PhD students. We have a long list of PhD students we supervise in development. And doing PhD admissions, the vast majority of people wanting to come here want to study development. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say that one of the fathers, the founding fathers of modern development economics, is Michael Kremer. Hadn't it been for Michael, there would be no field experiments in development, no serious theory applied to economic development, and all these bright minds who today apply to the LSE to do PhDs and go and change the world wouldn't be here in development. So thank you, Michael. The floor is yours.
I'll just say it's a great honor to be giving the Kapuscinski Lectures. I think this lecture is going to be using the methods of economics and quantitative analysis and maybe a little bit of modeling, but I think any serious development economics has to be predicated on a on-the-ground understanding of the society in which you're working and knowing the context. And Kapuscinski was wonderful at that, and I think he exemplified that. But to some extent, even by reading his work, I think I found it to be very, very insightful, and I felt like I was able to absorb a little bit of that secondhand. So I definitely, for those of you who haven't yet read Kapuscinski, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's really wonderful work. And I also want a few more thanks. I wanted to thank everybody for coming on Valentine's Day. Much appreciated. I'd like to thank, this is a somewhat unusual talk. There's a huge number of people whose work I'm going to draw on in a discussion tonight. That's in part because I'll be drawing on the work of an NGO, which I should disclose I helped found together with Sean Cole, which set up to try to do work in this area of digital agricultural extension. But we put a lot of emphasis on trying to measure impact and trying to learn about the field. And so this is really going to draw on the work of a lot of people associated with PAD, as well as other people who work in the field who are not part of PAD. Okay, so there's across a variety of sectors, there's, I think, a lot of very exciting developments in the use of information and communication technology for development. So let me just give you a few examples. So in health, the mobile phone apps to both provide information, but also to provide some performance management systems for community health workers have shown to have quite substantial effects, a 20% increase in actual visits to patients, for example. India is in the process of scaling that up to its more than 1 million community health workers. This is going to, the benefit cost ratio of something like this can be tremendous. In education, there's great work by Chris Nielsen in Chile and Dominican Republic and Justin Hastings in the US showing that in a lot of settings there's school choice, but parents often have very weak information. And providing parents with more information about the options for education can yield greatly improved outcomes. There's also cases where just government functioning can be improved through ICT. So work that I think I saw Torsten in the group audience here, so a PhD student here, Torsten Walter's done, just documents the enormous variation within poor countries in the pupil-teacher ratio across schools. Well, that's the sort of thing with better, there may be a lot of reasons for that. There may be deep political reasons for that. But at least Torsten's hypothesis is that a lot of the variation is actually within very small areas. It's not all sort of greater political influence for one place than the other. Now, obviously, that's a hypothesis. But to the extent that turns out to be the case, then better information and communication technology might help address some of those inequities and perhaps also lead to better outcomes for students. I'm doing some work with Guthrie Gray-Loeb and Willa Friedman on also in education, on assignment of new teachers to schools. These are not regular civil service teachers, or sort of semi-volunteers. Right now they're assigned randomly, or they had been assigned randomly, but the Kenyan government's just been introducing a process, a matching algorithm, that tries to take into account the preferences of teachers and eventually could take into account schools' preferences as well. So this is the sort of matching algorithm Al Roth is known for. And just as it's make life much easier for medical students being assigned to residencies in the US, this could make life easier for schools and teachers in Kenya, potentially. Give a couple of other examples. Social benefit administration. Work in India suggests that the employment guarantee scheme, a very large program, there's a lot of leakage. That could be improved both by having biometric smart cards India's had a huge program to give everybody a unique identity. That can reduce leakage, that was found to reduce leakage tremendously. And then just improving the flow of funds by being able to send funds not through multiple layers of bureaucracy, but straight from the state government to the village level, was also found to substantially reduce losses. Okay. This could be used in taxes, so work in Italy. Italy's been doing this to try and get a whole bunch of properties that are not on the property tax rolls, to identify them using satellite data and then get them on the tax rolls. And a huge innovation in worldwide tax policy worldwide has been the very rapid spread of value-added taxes, which went from a very low level decades ago and are now almost ubiquitous. One of the big advantages of value-added taxes, in theory, is that by comparing the tax submissions of the suppliers and of the purchasers, you can cross-check, and that could reduce fraud in taxation. Often, while that's theoretically possible, it's not actually done. Well, better ICT could potentially allow that to happen. So there's across a range of areas, there's at least theoretical potential, and whether this happens in practice is a very important question, which I'll touch on later. There's at least theoretical potential for technology to address problems of functioning of governments in developing countries. So you can see this as a way that could potentially contribute to the broader issue of state capacity. I don't want to exaggerate, and I'll try to be careful not to exaggerate. There's a lot of issues in state capacity that go well beyond anything that technology can address, but technology may be able to help. Okay. This talk will focus on the case of agriculture. Let me give a bit of background. There are 450 million poor smallholder farmers around the world, and obviously many more people that are dependent on those farms. There's over 1 million agricultural extension workers whose job is to provide agricultural information on inputs to use, on crop choice, et cetera, to farmers. Those systems they basically, in many developing countries, they don't work very well at all. There's not much evidence of impact or cost effectiveness. It's pretty expensive to send agricultural extension workers out into the field and to meet individually with farmers or even in groups. But of course, that even assumes that they get out to the field, and often they don't. And that's partly because of bureaucratic problems. There's no funding for transportation, just for the salaries. But it's also because of accountability problems that plague governments in many ways. It's just hard to supervise an agricultural extension workers and make sure they're doing their jobs. There's also corruption when they play a role in distributing inputs or subsidized inputs. There's often a lot of corruption as well. So these systems are often considered to be not very effective. Here are some statistics from India that just illustrate that point. Okay. So there's at least reason to think that there might be potential for mobile phones to play a big role in this area. So it's very low cost to transmit the information. Cell phone, when you think about the cost of sending cell phone messages, don't think the amount that you have to pay. Think the actual social technological cost, which is very close to zero, because rural cell phone capacity is underused. Once the cell phone's there, it can handle a certain amount of traffic. And in rural areas, that traffic typically isn't, it's not at capacity. Moreover, you can send things off at times that are off-peak. So it can be very low cost. It can be, I think, when I wrote reliable, may not be as reliable as the cell phone network that you might hope, but it's probably much, much more reliable than other forms of delivery, where any breakdown along the chain can mean that either the message isn't delivered at all or the message gets garbled. It can be provided in a timely way, so you can time to the agricultural season, or you can time to a pest outbreak or to some adverse weather conditions. You can customize this based on a variety of things, most obviously things like soil conditions, soil chemistry, which inputs are needed would depend on how much nitrogen's in the soil, et cetera. But you can also customize this to market conditions. So, for example, you might not want to suggest use of an input that isn't available in the local area. Now, actually implementing this can be a big challenge, but at least theoretically there's that possibility. Or output markets, how are there, if you're producing a crop like vegetables to sell to the city, then you need to be able to actually get that picked up and transported to the city. And if that's not going to happen, it may not be a good crop to grow. But that could potentially be coordinated and facilitated in part through technology. Mobile phones, one of the big findings in agricultural extension is that this shouldn't be thought of as a one-way system of extension agents transmitting information to farmers. Farmers have a lot of information themselves. Now, theoretically, a well-functioning agricultural extension collects that information from farmers and feeds it back into the system. So the agricultural researchers are aware of the problems farmers are facing in the field, for example. But all too often in developing countries, that system doesn't work very well for all sorts of institutional and sociological reasons in very hierarchical environments. The mobile phone systems, at least potentially, could be designed to collect information from farmers as well, get questions from farmers that are recorded, and I'll give you some examples of that later on, and have responses developed. I think there are gains from communicating with farmers and getting both ways, but there could also be gains from integration with other systems. So I mentioned that extension workers often, the performance of extension systems is often very weak. Well, extension workers could be provided with more information, so they could have, most farmers would just have feature phones. They can't do anything very advanced, but extension workers either have or will soon have smartphones. So they could play videos to farmers. They could communicate with the farmers in their area about, say, if they're going to be doing a demonstration plot in a particular area, in a particular technique, they could inform farmers about that. You could also help monitor, potentially, the work that extension workers are doing, making sure that they go out and visit the farmers rather than that they're supposed to. Don't worry, I'm singing the potential praises, but I'm going to come back to what the realities are. I mentioned some of the opportunities to integrate with suppliers and purchasers. I talked about the purchaser side, but on the supplier side, farmers could shop around for prices. There's problems of bad fertilizer or adulterated fertilizer. Maybe there are ways to help address that. There's a lot of interest right now in integration with financial service providers. If lenders know, based on satellite data and other data from a farmer, whether the harvest is looking good, maybe then that could influence their lending decisions. I'm maybe a little bit less gung-ho about that than the market is right now, but there are a lot of efforts in that direction. Or provision of insurance or social insurance. I think, again, I think private insurance markets are very hard to put together, typically, with some exceptions. But social insurance can be provided. If you know what's going on insuring an individual farmer may be difficult because there could be problems of moral hazard or adverse selection, but providing social insurance for farmers in a particular area, if you see that they're all having a bad harvest, then that's something that can be insured against. Okay. Just to add on to this, I think a lot of the things that I've listed are things that aren't being done and probably are a bit down the road and couldn't be done easily right away. But I think there are a number of technological advances that will create more opportunities for this. And this is partly data science advances so that, that could improve weather forecasts, could improve better understanding of soil chemistry based on a limited number of samples, that could allow improvement of tailoring of messages to even individual, what farmers have, have responded to in the past. It's possible to get better data on physical conditions, even using remote sensing. So spectroscopic analysis of soils can tell you a lot about the chemistry. There's work to try and look at what yields are based on satellite images. That's very exciting. Drones can play a role. And it's possible, so that makes it possible to collect a lot of information. But the widespread adoption of phones makes it possible to deliver some of this, but can be delivered in a much more sophisticated way once people have smartphones. And then I think there's also social science advances, in particular behavioral economics, I think can add a fair amount to this. Okay, so what we'll try and do in this talk, sort of laid out some potentially far off visions there, but I'd like to start off with just very basic systems. And what's some evidence, let's start off with just what's some evidence on just farmer behavior response. So a precondition for any of these things is that farmers would actually respond. So we'll start off looking at simple systems and what the impact is on farmer behavior. I think we've now got a fair amount of data on that. Then I'll look at data on yields, which I think is more limited and is tricky to collect for reasons I'll explain. But I think there's suggestive evidence on that, which is, I think, encouraging. Some analyses of cost effectiveness, which suggests this is actually the impacts, I don't want to say are huge, they're modest in absolute terms, but they are really huge in benefit cost terms because this is so cheap, even with existing technologies. I think they could potentially get better. Talk a little bit about some environmental outcomes as well. I'd like to discuss a bit emerging evidence on spillovers of knowledge. This may benefit not just the farmers who directly get the information, but other farmers. And some evidence on whether farmers could provide information, and some implications for overall design of the system and what we're learning about typical mistakes. So this will be sort of straight evaluation work. But then in the second part of the talk, I'd like to bring in more economic theory and some data that relates to that, both on the two scaling strategies for this, are two broad classes, market-based scaling strategies and scaling by government. And I think neither of these are going to be perfect, but I think the tools of economics can be very useful in thinking about some of the trade-offs with each, and what strategies within market-based and government-based solutions might be most effective. Okay, so as I say, most of the evidence is here. Has been gathered by Precision Agriculture for Development, collaboration with researchers, but also in collaboration with implementers. So those are governments in some cases, companies in others, NGOs. While I'll focus on agriculture, I think some of the lessons, I'll try and come back to this, are relevant more broadly for technology-enabled information provision. So for example, in the educational context, and helping people make decisions about, make more informed decisions about about educational choices. Okay. I will also be making the argument that the knowledge that we can gain through experimentation of this type is really a global public good, and that the economics of that are also worth thinking about. Okay, so that's background. Start out with some evidence on impact before talking about scaling through markets and then through governments. So let me start off with what's called a meta-analysis. So this combined evidence from a number of different studies that we've done that we're looking at the problem of soil acidity. So a lot of soils in developing countries are particularly in Africa, East Africa, are acidic. And they become more acidic over time as they continue to be farmed. Soil acidity can be addressed with lime. So those of you who are home gardeners probably have some experience with this. And so the simple question was, if people get messages about this through a cell phone, and we'll start off with the very simplest type of message, the cheapest and lowest tech, which is just an SMS message. You can think of a lot of reasons why this wouldn't work. You know, people get a lot of spam. They might ignore the messages. There are problems of literacy. Lots of reasons why this might, and they might not be able to afford the Lyme. They might not believe in the Lyme, all sorts of issues. But we did a meta-analysis of several different programs. Using the administrative data, in all of these cases, we had ways of collecting administrative data on purchases from one particular source. So a lot of this work was with a large NGO called 1 Acre Fund, which provides inputs on credit to farmers. So we were able to get data on their sales. Okay? That suggests that we got typically a 19%, or sort of averaging across these settings, of increase in following Lyme recommendations. That was typically on a modest base. Not many farmers start out using Lyme, although now more and more of them are. So that's nothing to sneeze at, but it's not something that's going to be transformative. The effects in self-reported data, by the way, are larger. I'm not sure which of these. I think probably this might be an underestimate because some people might buy through other channels. I suspect that these self-reported data are an overestimate. There's a methodological lesson there about limitations of just relying on self-reported data. But even with these more conservative administrative data, this suggests benefit-cost ratios, sort of 6 to 36-fold. Even if there's no long-lasting effect of this, even if it's just the effect in that year and it goes away thereafter. Okay. There's starting to put together evidence, and it's preliminary at this stage, but suggests that there's information spillovers. It's not just the people with the phones who are benefiting, but it's also there are some members of 1 Acre Fund who don't have phones, particularly in Rwanda, and it looks like they're benefiting from this as well. It doesn't look, there may be some persistence of this, but you certainly don't get full persistence of this into the next agricultural season. So that, if this were purely a model of learning in a classical Bayesian rational learning framework, you might expect this to persist. You try it out, you realize it's good, you keep using it. It could be that you realize it's bad, and that's why it doesn't persist, but I actually don't think that's what's going on because the trends overall are going upwards, and the program remains effective. So there's no evidence, for example, of message fatigue. People who get a message the next year are also adopt. They're less likely to adopt. I think this may actually shed, this would be a separate talk, but I think this may shed some light on behavioral models of learning, behavioral models of input use more generally. We checked for another type of possible downside of sending too many messages, right? I think we all get a lot of messages that we'd rather not get in our email. Maybe this is negative spillovers on other things. So 1 Acre Fund is an NGO that's trying to do all sorts of things. It's trying to provide fertilizer, it's trying to tell people about solar lights and health practices. We didn't see any evidence of negative effects, and in fact, at least some suggestive evidence of some positive spillovers in other areas, which might be in part because Lyme helps directly, but it also makes other inputs more effective. We did a lot of work on message tailoring. So we've run a lot of different varieties of messages, and I'm not going to go into that, but there's some potential differences there, but I don't think we know yet whether things are robust, so I'm going to not discuss that today. One thing I want to emphasize is, if you're trying to do this type of work, you'll need very large samples. So in some cases, there were hundreds of thousands of farmers involved. That's because there's a lot of, we shouldn't get overly optimistic about the impact that a mobile phone message is going to have, given all the other constraints that farmers face. So we're not going to see necessarily huge effects. Particularly, that's even true with behavior, but certainly if we're going all the way through to yields, there are so many other things, there's so much background noise in yields, it's hard to pick up effects without a large sample. Now, it's one thing to pick up the overall effect, but if you're trying to get heterogeneous effects of different phrasing of the messages, you need pretty large samples. Okay. But you're able to get those. The other thing that I think is very helpful is meta-analysis, because sometimes something will show up in one study, but you don't know, is that real? Well, economists tend to say, well, we should write down a pre-analysis plan. The way that scientists often work is they say, well, we do some experiments to generate our hypotheses, and then we do another experiment to actually test them. And this is a setting where you can, if you're working with partners, you can definitely do that, because you can do repeated experiments over time in the same way that a tech firm might do them. Okay. Let me give a little bit of evidence on higher touch approaches. So this is a study that I wasn't involved in, using video in Bihar. So they were trying to promote an approach to rice cultivation that uses less water and fewer inputs in general. And they saw an increase in adoption of 6 percentage points on a base of 11%. So that's a bigger effect than from these SMS messages, and that suggests that perhaps going to more higher touch technologies might have a bigger impact. I don't want to, we don't have a meta-analysis of video yet. But let me talk about another higher tech approach that doesn't involve video, but does involve voice-based mobile advisory systems. So the SMS messages, that was just a few, few SMS messages per season. So it's very, very light touch. People are getting weekly push calls with advice and weather forecasts and so on. Farmers could also ask questions via a hotline. Then that would go to a group of agronomists who would record responses, and that would be made available to other farmers. Farmers could also respond to each other and share info with each other. Okay. That program, first, I just want to stress the very high levels of uptake of this. So if you look, most farmers called into the line. Quite a number of them, 40% of them, actually asked a question. A bunch of them, 17% recorded a message or responded to questions. And people generally stayed on the line throughout the push call. Let me mention this for a couple of reasons. First, I think these are pretty impressive numbers. But second, and I should say, I wish I was involved with this study. This is Cole and Fernando's work, not mine. If you look down here, you'll get the citations. But this type of data, so if you can get data on how long, which messages are people staying on the line for, which they aren't, those are all intermediate outcomes that you can study and you can do A/B tests on to try and find out what messages work better and which ones don't. That may improve the system, but if you're interested in maybe drawing more general behavioral lessons, you may be able to get that from it as well. Okay? So this suggests farmers are willing to contribute information that they find it worth spending their time on. Okay? What about productivity increases? So these are the point estimates that suggest substantial productivity increases, 8.6% for cotton and 28% for cumin. There's only one star on this one, so I don't think the case is airtight here. They had multiple outcomes. But the point estimate is $100 per season increase per farm. So that's but that is just marginally significant. There's also some evidence of information spillovers, which will tend to make it harder to pick up the effect, but are economically interesting in their own right. Here's another case where we were able to measure output. So in a lot of cases, take 1 acre fund, they supply inputs for maize farmers. The farmers then eat the maize, they take it to local market, they sell it. It's very hard to measure yield in that setting. You could go out and try and do crop cuts, but that's very, very expensive. There's work trying to take photographs from satellites. That's very exciting technology, but not necessarily quite ready to use except in research to improve the methodology right now. Maybe a year it'll be there, but we worked with a big sugarcane company. So for sugarcane and a number of other crops, farmers, the processing is very intensive. So there's a natural monopoly for the sugarcane processing facility, and farmers typically in an area sell to that company. So if you work with a company, the company then can give inputs to farmers on credit, so they have data on the inputs. But they also have data on the output, because that's what they have to weigh the sugar and pay the farmer accordingly. So we did a couple of trials. one of them found that the SMS messages raised sugarcane yields 8%, and actually only 2/3 of the farmers actually got the messages, so really almost 12% overall. Second trial, we found smaller effects that were not statistically significantly different from zero, but we also couldn't reject a 7% yield gain. So why these different effects? Well, at this point, I can't tell you. Maybe it's just random sampling variation. We couldn't reject that hypothesis. It could also be, as I'll tell you later, this sugarcane company was going through a very difficult period, a lot of management problems. Maybe farmer trust in this company was declining over time. I don't think we know, but this is all speculative. But this does suggest that, in contrast to the maize example, where we couldn't reject that there was very similar effects for these studies. There's at least across studies here, there's at least some evidence of that maybe subtle differences can matter. Okay? But could just be sampling variation. Okay. There was another study that we did with the same company. This was quite different. Okay? This was looking not at the information that can be supplied to farmers, but the information that farmers can supply. So, as I mentioned, this sugarcane company provides inputs to farmers on credit. So they provide the fertilizer. Well, you have to apply the fertilizer at the right time. If you apply it outside of that time, there's going to be a lower yield response. If there's a lower yield response, that's very bad for the farmer. They've just bought these inputs on credit. Now they're not going to get what they expected out of them, and they're still going to have to pay back this money. So for farmers to complain about this was quite a hassle. They often, it was a very big catchment area. They might have to travel many hours to get to the company to complain to somebody. Even if they complain to someone, they're going to complain to a low-level official who will talk to their supervisor, talk to their supervisor, talk to their supervisor. This is all within the one department of the company. And then it's an entirely separate department that actually does the deliveries of the inputs. So they'd have to get the message over to that other part of the company. So just from an organizational perspective, that process wasn't working very well. So then it's really not worth trying to complain about this. You just hope it's going to show up later. Well, with a hotline, farmers could call in, and that data could be aggregated and supplied to the top management of the company in a much easier to understand way. And that led to a pretty dramatic reduction in some cases, in a small number of cases, but 10% of cases, farmers weren't getting their inputs at all. So that went down by 30%. And then there was a 20% reduction in late delivery of fertilizer. So that's an example where information from farmers is actually very valuable, and farmers have an incentive to provide that information. This also benefited nearby farmers, because if they weren't delivering fertilizer in one area, into a particular farmer, they probably weren't delivering it to their neighbors either. So we saw gains there as well. Okay, so what are some lessons on just the impact? So across a variety of settings, we saw gains that were, at least for the simplest systems, pretty modest in absolute terms, although some of these gains I'm talking about now are they'll make a real difference to the lives of a farmer. The fact, I've noted that earlier that you'll need large sample sizes to pick up subtle differences across messages. But while I've said they're modest in absolute terms, they're very large relative to the marginal costs. And at least they have the potential to be, particularly these somewhat more advanced systems. And that suggests that when they're large relative to the marginal cost, the cost of a cell phone message, that suggests that to make this effective, this has the potential to be very effective, but only if it's done at large scale. If you're doing a small scale system, it's not going to be nearly as cost effective, because you have to design the system, get the technology in place, work with the phone company, test the messages, et cetera. Those are all lessons about these simple systems. There's the bit of evidence that we have about the more technologically complex systems suggests the gains can be much more substantial there. So I would characterize this as saying, this is quite a big win in terms of rate of return on investment. There's the potential for quite a big win, not a very big win in terms of rates of return on investment. I would say quite a big. This was 6 to 36-fold, so huge actually, but could be truly enormous with some of the newer technologies. Okay. So then, how would you scale this? So let me turn to the more economics-y part of this talk. So one approach is through markets, another approach is through governments. And here, let's start with the markets. There are a lot of, I'm starting with that partly because economists are trained to do that, but partly because most of the organizations that are working in this area, and there are a number of startups, there's startup for-profit firms, there's NGOs with the social enterprise model. Most of them are trying a market-based approach. And in particular, trying a subscription-based approach, where they charge they charge a farmer for messages, okay? And a lot of, not only are organizations trying this, but the funders who put money into this, I don't know about the European Union program, but typically they make that a key metric for judging, is the organization succeeding or not? Are they getting to the point where they're covering, if you're covering none of your costs, that's bad. If you're covering 10%, 20%, we're starting to see progress, and 60%, but they want you to aim for 100%, and the question is, are you going to get there? That's the metric. They look at this the same way a private investor would. Okay? Even though it's mostly socially oriented organizations that are making these investments right now. Okay? I'm going to argue that economics suggests very important limits of that approach. Now, to be clear, there's also very important limits of a government-based approach. We're dealing in a second-best world at best. So I'll discuss that later on. Let me start with the very basic. There's a bunch of very interesting economics of information. Let me start with the observation that goes back to Arrow and before, but Romer's work recently received a lot of recognition for his articulation of it. And it's a very simple point. The cost of a mobile phone message is basically zero. That's going to create both static distortions. So here's a standard monopoly pricing diagram. Here's a demand curve. Let's price on this axis, the quantity purchased on this axis. There's some people who value this a lot. There are other people who don't value it nearly as much. A provider, let's take a monopoly provider to start with. They're going to choose the profit maximizing price. That's going to mean a bunch of people put positive value on this, but less than the profit maximizing price are not going to be served, and that's deadweight loss. So that's one problem with this. Okay, another problem with this is the total revenue that's collected is just this rectangle. Some of this will be consumer surplus that goes to the customers, but are they going to invest in setting up the system? There are important costs of setting up the system, as I mentioned earlier. Well, in a situation, what would a social planner do? Well, the social planner would invest if the fixed cost is less than the entire area under the demand curve, because then the social benefits of this exceed the cost of setting up the system. The monopolist is only going to invest if the potential revenue exceeds the cost of setting up the system. So there may be cases in which it's socially optimal to invest, but it won't be profitable for a firm to do that. Is that empirically relevant? That's the question. But let me start with this. There's other bits of theory I'd like to bring in, but let me start with this one. Okay. By the way, I should note that this diagram is assuming that this is a non-rival good in Romer's terminology, predates Romer, but that he emphasizes. But this is, in some ways, the best case. I'm assuming what's called full excludability here. So the only people who get access to the information are the people who purchase it from the monopolist. And that might not be true, as I'll discuss in a minute. Okay, so here's some data, also from work of Cole and Fernando in India. And this tries to estimate the demand curve for this information. So you remember that the yearly increase, I gave the seasonal increase before, the yearly increase in profitability, their estimate is $200. Okay, it costs about $20 to provide. These SMS messages cost virtually nothing, and their social cost is virtually nothing. But these are weekly voice messages, and it has agronomists recording the answers. It's not nothing for this service. Okay, how much were farmers willing to pay? Well, they were willing to pay about, on average, about $2 for a 6-month subscription. So the social value of this looks pretty high, but the willingness to pay of farmers is nowhere near as big. So this is going to be something where, and their calculations suggest it's not going to be possible to launch this as a profitable product. Okay, now, that doesn't mean nothing. Maybe in another society with somewhat richer farmers, or if costs come down, maybe it eventually would. But it's not going to be profitable privately in their context. But let me point something else out. I drew a stylized linear demand curve before. But demand curves in the real world often look much more like this. Okay? In this type of a setting, if you imagine inscribing a rectangle here, you'll see there's going to be a lot of deadweight loss relative to that rectangle. And moreover, that rectangle is going to be a fairly small fraction of the area under the demand curve. So you'll have the static distortions and the dynamic distortions can both be pretty severe. Okay? And that's, their data suggests that that's going to be the case as well in this setting. Okay? But there's also a puzzle being generated here. Why are people willing to pay so much less than what seems to be the value of the service? Okay? So let me talk about some other issues here. I'm going to give, actually, before I do that, let me give another example. This suggests that this isn't unique to India. So this is a case of soil chemistry in an area in Kenya where I do a lot of work. So this is graphs of soil pH. That's what determines whether you need lime, for example. So you see a lot of areas have low pH, but some areas within this county in Kenya have perfectly adequate pH. Okay? On nitrogen, most areas don't have enough nitrogen, but some areas do. Same with phosphorus. Here's carbon. Okay? You also see that this is very geographically, there's geographical correlation. Okay, so if you know something about your neighbor's soil conditions, that tells you something about your own soil conditions. Well, it's also the case that there's noise in any soil test. So I grew up in Kansas, and one of the things Kansas State University would do is they have soil judging competitions when teams would go out and do soil tests, and you'd compete on the accuracy of how well you could do that. But in this setting, if you test the soil in a farm and you go back to the same farm and test it again, the correlation's about 0.7. So you're not going to get perfect information even from one test on your own farm. By the way, one test that involves like 20 different samples from around the farm. So obviously they do the basics there. But why have I gone through all these patterns of correlation? Well, they imply that information from neighboring farms is valuable for me. Because since my own test is noisy, since I know I'm correlated with my neighbor's information then is going to be helpful for me in understanding what to do. I shouldn't put, if I know the test for myself and from my neighbor and from my neighbor's neighbor, put higher weight on my test, but I should put some weight on my neighbor and in fact on my neighbor's neighbor. And there's statistical techniques for doing this called kriging. Sort of think of this as autocorrelation for those of you who are economists, but in 2 dimensions. Okay. So how does this relate to the economics? Well, these tests cost about $10. So no farmers, to a first approximation, no farmers ordering these tests on their own. These guys have an acre, 2 acres. It's not worth it to get a soil test. Okay? But as part of a study done for unrelated purposes, we got some soil tests done, and we provided that information to the farmers whose soil was tested. But then we thought, well, we'll go to in fact, this is partly how I got involved in this area. We went to the neighbors and we said, would you like this information, and how much would you be willing to pay for it? And in fact, we found that they gave numbers that were much higher than we would have guessed. Okay? These were $2, up to $5. Now, this was a little bit sensitive to how we asked the question. There could be some experimenter demand effects.